Miss any of our previous ones, the previous sessions are available on our YouTube channel. Some of them may be audio and not video. We're still playing around with the technology and trying to find the best way to do it, because the recording device, the recording that Zoom uses, records at a very high level, so the files are a little unwieldy. But anyhow, if you're having trouble accessing any of our older classes, let me know and I'll go try and find the files for you. So today we are going to read through chapter 5, and this is our 7th session. So welcome everyone, nice to see you all. And we spent 2 sessions on chapter 2, and a lot of the chapters in this first part of the guide are to do with words in Hebrew, and Maimonides describing how they're seen traditionally and how he would like to change some of those, or maybe not change, but how he sees them and how they relate to his general ideas and thoughts. And then every now and then he has these chapters which take a step back, and I find them to be quite interesting as well. So we're now on chapter 5, and we're going to try and read through all of it if possible. And for this chapter, what I would like us to discuss, and we can take other tangents as well, is this is one of Maimonides' core ideas that we go back to, and we've already discussed and seen in other places. But how does it relate to how we understand what Maimonides is talking about? How is it different for us than for a philosopher in the medieval times or for the Jews of Maimonides' time? And how does it translate to us as modern people and modern Jews? So we're going to begin. I'm going to share the screen, and we have chapter 5 open here. And by tradition, Alan will begin.
Okay. When the chief of the philosophers began to investigate very obscure matters and to attempt a proof concerning them, he excused himself by making a statement, the meaning of which was as follows. A student of his books should not, because of the subject of these researches, ascribe to him effrontery, temerity, and an excess of hate to speak of matter, in excess of haste, to speak of matters of which he has no knowledge, but rather he should ascribe to him the desire and the endeavor to acquire and achieve true beliefs to the extent to which this is in the power of man. In the same way, we say that man should not hasten too much to accede to this great and sublime matter at the first try, without having made his soul undergo training in the sciences and the different kinds of knowledge, having truly improved his character, and having extinguished the desires and cravings engendered in him by his imagination. When, however, he has achieved and acquired knowledge of true and certain premises, and has achieved knowledge of the rules of logic and inference, and of the various ways of preserving himself from errors of the mind, he then should engage in the investigation of this subject. When doing this, he should not make categoric affirmations in favor of the first opinion that occurs to him, and should not from the outset strain and impel his thoughts toward the apprehension of the deity, but rather should feel awe and refrain and hold back until he gradually elevates himself. It is in this sense that it is said, and Moses had his face, for he was afraid to look upon God.
So, Alan, let's just stop here before we get into. We're going to be talking about Moses, but how would you summarize what we just read, what Maimonides has just been saying?
I find it interesting that he seems to be talking about studying sciences, the physical world, mathematics, etc., and then all of a sudden makes this leap into trying to find God.
Why is that unusual? Why is that unusual for you or for our society?
Well, if I'm studying science, I'm studying science to find some answers into what the physical world is like, not to necessarily all of a sudden be able to understand what God is and what God comprises, if you will.
So
Not what he's doing.
You wouldn't think that your chemistry students would come to your chemistry class as a preparation to then study theology.
Yeah, I wouldn't expect them to think that I'm God.
I don't see it that way. I think Maimonides was saying you have to bring a trained mind that is used to inquiry and deep thinking. And that's to the study of God. And that's, I think, why he says you should study other things first.
Yeah, he's talking about refining the intellect, the refining thinking, and all of his emphasis is on refining thinking, making fine distinctions in thought. Like, for example, the chapters that we didn't talk about have to do with making fine distinctions in thought. And if you make fine distinctions in thought over periods of time, your intellect gets a little bit sharper. And his whole pursuit of God is through the intellect, through thinking, not through prayer, but through thinking. And that's what he's pushing us towards.
But you can't study Science 101 and expect to have the knowledge and the abilities to start thinking about God at that point. And that's what this actually sounds like when I read it.
Well, it's not science 101. It's, of course, the sciences were really quite different in that era. And the sciences were mostly intellectual sciences. They weren't empirical sciences. So if you studied science, you studied the logic of the thing rather than looking at experimental data that we have now. So it all had to do with the mind. And this all gets sort of torn apart during the Enlightenment, which comes about 500 years after Maimonides. So when he's talking about science, he's talking about the mind at work, trying to study nature.
So this is it. I mean, he's talking about the mind, but he's also talking about ethical and moral and truly improving the character, extinguishing desires and cravings. But he's talking about preparation. How do you prepare for experience, for apprehending God, for apprehending the higher realms? And so he's saying you need a training in logic, a training in fine-tuning the mind. And just,
one other thing, though, it seems like he's also speaking to the concept of humility. Which is like less of an intellectual concept and more of a, there's obviously some integration of the concept of humility when you approach classwork, but just the idea that you approach humility like Moses here, almost in the same sense of humbling oneself, in addition to the intellectual humbling that you have to go through.
Right.
And I think there's also and then there's the idea of humility. He talks about Moses a lot in that way. And also, we take for granted that we have 12 years of education in sciences and general subjects. And a lot of us have, and then university, we have a very broad education. But for people in those days, we can imagine what the education may have been like, especially if you did not have access to the types of teachers, of schools that Moses did, that Maimonides Moses did. And so what that does to a person to prepare them, and this is not unique to philosophy, right? The philosophers had their ideas of how you prepare for these things. But what did the Kabbalists say? At the same time, or 100 years later, you have to be 40 and male, and there's all this ideas of preparing yourself for apprehending for spiritual matters. And so it's very true. Maimonides' approach is all about how his strategy for reaching God is through the mind, it's through thinking, it's through this very intellectual approach, which I think works for some people in our days, but not everybody. So maybe let's begin to think about, just for our own selves, we live very different lives, we have very different training, we have different contexts, and what is the equivalent of this in our societies, in our spiritual paths, the preparations that we need to undergo to be able to reach that. So we'll talk about that a little bit more afterwards. But let's see why this is so important for Maimonides. And I think this is still, this is an enduring idea. I mean, it's a very traditional idea, but it's a very enduring idea.
Well, he also takes a note of caution. He says, even if you're looking to look to your true beliefs, don't take the first opinion that comes to your mind. Mm-hmm. And it kind of reminds me of my mother, who said, think before you speak. Mm-hmm. And I think that's what Maimonides is trying to tell us here, that we need to think before we speak, so that we don't jump and make assumptions just based on our knowledge level while we're trying to answer these questions. We need to be cautious about how we come to conclusions about what we entertain.
In Maimonides' path, this is very important. The idea of really, he says, we didn't read this part, can't read the whole book because it would take us years, but he says I put in tremendous, he says every word in the whole book he thought out, right? Every word. So he wrote this book with that intention of that intellectual intensity and sharpness, and that's his path. Again, I'm not sure how many people that this path works for, and I think it's got elements of similarity to, I think about the Talmudic path, or a path of, in any discipline where you're really trying to sharpen your mind to the utmost. But I think his is also transcends that, because it is ultimately what I call spiritual, because it's about apprehending God. So how could that not be spiritual? But
in a rational way.
Yeah, in a rational way. But also there is an element of it where he lets go of rationality at some level, at some point, right? And he says you need to be moderate in all of your qualities and all of your thinking, except in your love for God. And your love of God, you should be lovesick, as a lovesick person for their spouse. So Maimonides also has that. He's the most rational, but then he's also willing. There's a place where he lets go of that. So let's move forward, and we'll continue this discussion as we see where it goes. Because let's talk about how he relates it to our scriptures and stories in the Torah. So actually, before we do this, we're going to go back to the text itself, and then we'll read some more. Would someone else like to read? Actually, let's begin again. It is in this sense that it is said.
Where? Oh.
At the very top. It is in this sense it is said, 16b.
I'll read.
Thank you.
It is in the sense that it is said, and Moses hid his face, for he was afraid to look upon God. This being an additional meaning of the verse over and above its external meaning, that indicates that he hid his face because of his being afraid to look upon the light manifesting itself, and not that the deity, who is greatly exalted above every deficiency, can be apprehended by the eyes. Moses, peace be unto him, was commended for this. And God, may he be exalted, let overflow upon him so much of his bounty and goodness that it became necessary to say of him, and the figure of the Lord shall he look upon. The sages.
So let's just wait for a second. We're going to go quickly look at some of those texts just to see what is he talking about and to understand it better. So the first text that he quotes is the story of the burning bush. Michael, do you mind reading just for us Exodus 3:5-6?
And he said, do not come closer. Remove your sandals from your feet, for the place on which you stand is holy ground. I am, he said, the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. And Moses hid his face, for he was afraid to look at God.
So, Moses, the greatest prophet, is afraid to look at God. So this is what Maimonides is picking up on, and finds it's there in our commentary tradition. You mind reading on, Michael, please?
Sure. Chizkuni. Moses hid his face. The fact that Moses hid his face at this point was the reason that he merited that he eventually attained a spiritual level when his own face radiated spirituality to the degree that unless he was discussing Torah, the people could not bear looking at him. Compare also Numbers 12:8, where God explains this level of Moses to Miriam and Aaron.
So there's an idea, right? This is where Maimonides is going to go, where if you hold yourself back earlier on and don't try and go too fast, and you will reap the rewards later on. So let's just Rabbeinu Bachya, who was coming a generation after Nachmanides, who in some ways is the traditional arguer, the one who argues and debates Maimonides in the commentaries, because more on the Kabbalistic than on the philosophic end, but really many of their ideas are actually quite similar. So Rabbeinu Bachya is quoting the Talmud that Maimonides is about to, and I'm explaining this, I think, in its fullest way. So Michael, if you don't mind continuing, that'd be great.
No problem. Seeing he had turned aside at the bush, not wanting to look at something forbidden, he was granted to behold the image of God's face. Seeing he displayed the proper degree of awe and reverence in the presence of such a vision, biyera, for he was afraid, verse 6, he was granted that when he descended from Mount Sinai, the skin of his forehead radiated light, so the people in turn were afraid to approach him. Finally, as a reward for not having indulged his eyes, Mahabit, when he had a chance to do so at the bush, he was granted greater visions than any other prophet, as God explained to Miriam and Aaron on that occasion. Whereas visions seen by lesser prophets are known as askflir.
It's
Aramaic, yeah.
Aramaic word.
Askflaria sheina meira, blurred visions. Moses enjoyed visions described as meira, distinct, brilliant. The latter is the kind of vision which originates with the attribute of mercy.
So this is the aspacularia is an idea that comes up a lot, very much in Maimonides and other places. It's prophets. This whole idea though, how do prophets see God? Do they see God clearly? So Moses, he's the one who saw the most clear, like a completely clear lens onto God. But then once you start going down the ranks, those second-rate prophets, they only saw God with a shadier, and eventually you get down to the level where you only see God in visions or in dreams. And it's all about apprehending, right, the overflow or apprehending those waves coming from God. So let's. So this is the basic idea that Maimonides is working with, right? And why were we saying before? Why shouldn't you rush into go with your first thoughts, your first try, your first, rushing into this? You need to build up a foundation. You need to make sure your mind is sharp. You need to have this cross-disciplinary preparation, both of the mind, but also moral and humility and ethical and all these ideas. And then, like Moses, right? He's, about to say, right? Even Moses, our greatest prophet, at the bush, he hid his face. He didn't try and look too fast. He was preparing himself. So let's go back to our text and read on. Would someone read on for us Where did you stop, Michael? Was it
And at the next pasuk, and the figure of the Lord shall I look upon. After
Okay.
that.
okay? You know what's and that's another pasuk that he's just real quickly go to that. He's quoting. It's worth looking at. So some of this is general knowledge and but important for context. Numbers,
Yeah.
right? This is when Miriam and Aaron spoke ill of Moses and said, why is he the leader? Aren't we also holy and we don't like his wife? So that didn't go down very well with Moses or God. So this is what God answers, right? Not so with my servant Moses. He is trusted throughout my household. When I speak with him, I speak mouth to mouth, plainly and not in riddles, and he beholds the likeness of the Lord. How then did you not shrink from speaking against my servant Moses? So God spells it out. You think you're Moses, but you're not Moses, which is a tone which Maimonides also takes in this for all those people who also think they're Moses, or who think that they have what they offer. Talking about having respect for what we're doing here, right? Spiritual apprehension, spiritual path, the quest of wisdom. This is not something to be taken lightly, but something that has to be worked towards. Wait, wrong
I
share.
find it interesting that since Moses was the greatest prophet, why did God speak plainly to him, yet speak in riddles to the lesser ones who would have trouble discerning what the riddles mean, and the knowledge of the things that God wants would be harder for those prophets to understand.
I love that I love that comment. Well, it seems
Show up much later.
Yeah, Maimonides would say, God doesn't speak in riddles, but the way their radio receiver wasn't tuned enough to be able their mind wasn't sharp enough, their spiritual mental apparatus wasn't sharp enough, and so they understood it as riddles, but God wasn't speaking riddles to them. It was just the way they understood it. But I think I love that point, right? Why you don't speak riddles to those that have trouble understanding, try and speak in a simpler language to them. All right, let's continue reading the nobles of the children of Israel. Someone else.
Sure, I'll read.
Thank you.
The nobles of the children of Israel, on the other hand, were over hasty, strained their thoughts, and achieved apprehension, but only in an imperfect one. Hence is it said of them, and they saw the God of Israel, and there was under his feet, and so on, and not merely, and they saw the God of Israel. For these words were solely intended to present a criticism of their act of seeing, not to describe the manner of their seeing. Thus they were solely blamed for the form that their apprehension took, inasmuch as corporality entered into it to some extent. This being necessitated by their over hasty rushing before they had reached perfection.
So let's stop there for a minute.
Perish.
So I didn't pull up the verses for this. I didn't want to spend too much time on it, but this is chapter 19 and 20 of Exodus. We have the story of the 10 Commandments, and the way the Midrash describes it, all the children of Israel heard all the commandments, or heard just the first letter. It was this great spiritual experience. And then Moses is still up the mountain, or he goes back up the mountain, and he receives the laws that become the next parsha, Mishpatim, laws to do with all kinds of facets of Jewish life. But then you have this really super interesting story that most people forget about and don't think about at the end of Parsha Mishpatim, where suddenly Moses goes back up the mountain with the nobles of the children of Israel. And then it says, and they saw, he goes up with the children of Israel and with Aaron and Aaron's sons, and they saw the God of Israel, and there was under his feet a pavement of sapphire. And so, actually, maybe we'll pull it up just because it's an important story. So what he's saying is that they saw the feet, and obviously God, Maimonides does not believe God has feet. So that's them not apprehending God properly. That's them injecting their own imagination into it, and instead of seeing,
Actually, they saw under his feet.
they saw under his feet the pavement.
Under feet.
Mhm.
The,
They saw pavement of fire.
yeah, the under his feet comes up in the Ezekiel's vision too, with the sapphire stone, which is equated with the throne.
Mhm.
And this is one of the visions that Ezekiel has that's over the head of the four creatures.
Mhm.
So, I mean, the thing is that particular thing, at least to my thinking, is the rational part of thinking is the sapphire stone. It's a transparent thing, and it's also known as the throne. Maimonides makes that connection later on in the book, that the sapphire stone and the throne that's over the head of the four creatures is the same thing.
So the Talmud has a whole description of it, and it talks about how the pavement of sapphire, the throne of glory, the sky and the sea are all, it's the color of techelet, is the color of the tzitzit, of the thread of blue in the tzitzit. So the way I often look at that is that's the color at the edge of consciousness before you go on to some kind of transcendent reality. And that's
but it's all tied to this concept of haste and not being hasty.
Mhm.
And so it's an example in Maimonides' mind as I see it. I think he's showing us an example where that haste or not haste is important.
He's saying that they made a mistake. They weren't ready. We're going to get even more into it, but let's just quickly read this. And 9. Let's just read 9 to 12, 9 to 11. Paul, do you mind reading 9 to 11? Can you see that? Make it a little bit bigger.
That's fine. Then Moses and Aaron, Nadab and Abihu, and 70 elders of Israel ascended, and they saw the God of Israel. Under his feet there was the likeness of a pavement of sapphire, like the very sky for purity. Yet he did not raise his hand against the leaders of the Israelites. They beheld God, and they ate and drank.
Okay.
The Lord said to Moses, "Come up to me on the mountain and wait there, and I will give you the stone tablets with the teachings and commandments which I have inscribed to instruct them."
Thank you. So yet he did not raise his hand against the leaders of the Israelites makes you think there was a reason why he would have raised his hand against them.
Well, I think, is he not saying, in a sense, you're not worthy, go ahead and deal with the reality that in the physical that you know, and I'm going to send Moses on forward to get the stones and the commandments.
Is God, well, it's hard to know what the pshat of the Torah is. The pshat of the Torah might just be that God was in a mood of showing. This is, I mean, scholars will look at that passage and say it was a different version of Sinai from a different source, right? That's what scholars will say. You had one version which was all of the children of Israel at the base of the mountain receiving the Torah, and the other is that the elders apprehended God. That's a huge deal, and they lived. But then, of course, Moses, they weren't able to do that for too long, but they had a festive meal, right? We have festive meals whenever we have something special happening, and they go down. But Maimonides is looking at it, as you were saying, to make a point about them not being ready, being over hasty compared to where Moses was. So let's continue.
Rabbi, maybe I'm jumping ahead.
Yeah.
But what would Maimonides think about the fact that the children of Israel said, "We will do, and then we will learn. We will do, and then we will understand"? Wasn't that being a bit hasty in his respect then? Not learning about the commandments before starting to obey them?
Well, he has all kinds of ideas about commandments and why you should obey them or not. But part of his is, I mean, he spent a great part of his career, right, writing a compendium of those basic laws, right, of the laws that the children of Israel said they would follow before they would understand them. And my sense, at least, is that he saw all of those laws, and he talks about a little bit in the beginning of the Mishneh Torah as a prerequisite in moral and ethical behavior that help perfect your character and that help, prepare you for other levels of, philosophic contemplation. And so, he might just say, that's what they needed to do. I hope we get to it at some point, but because I find the second half of the guide to be, in some ways, easier to relate to. But he has one place, he has this parable where he explains the different levels of people who are, how close you are to the inner sanctum of a castle, is the way he describes. And there are those people who are in the courtyards, and those people who are outside and then within, and those who are in the chambers of the king or queen, so to speak. And so the people who are only doing the law and don't know the reason for the law are not very far into the castle. So he does definitely think that when you also are doing it out of knowing why you're doing it is important. And Maimonides is one of those who believe that every law had a purpose. And it's, one of the big debates within Judaism is, do our mitzvot have purpose or do they not have purpose? And if you can't ascertain their purpose, is it because they don't have it, or is it because you're just not looking into it properly enough?
Maimonides is kind of an apologist at the end. I mean, we haven't gotten there yet, but it's very interesting how he closes this chapter. And he says, if you're where you are, that's where you are, and there's no harm in that. So, you go through all of this, and then he says, sei gesund, it was a little surprising to me.
Yeah, well, better sei gesund than to get fried. So that's part of his, part of his message. And of course, Nadav and Avihu, right, the sons of Aaron, they're the ones who rush into the tent and who get zapped by God. So it all works. It's all working into the message he's trying to give to you, right? Don't go faster than you can. And translator that I am, I translate this in a different. I'm not trying to take Maimonides speaking to me as if I was a 12th century Jew or philosopher. I'm trying to see how his message is speaking to me from where we are. And I'd like to get into that conversation in a little bit, because I think it opens up to how does this relate to our own ideas of contemplating God or contemplating the universe, or that element of our practice of Judaism. So let's continue reading. Thus they were solely blamed. Is that where we were? For these words are solely intended to present. Let's just read from the beginning of the second column, the nobles of the children of Israel. Who can, Nancy, do you mind reading for us?
Sure. The nobles of the children of Israel, on the other hand, were over hasty, strained in their thoughts, and achieved apprehension, but only after an imperfect one. Hence it is said of them, and they saw the God of Israel, and there was under his feet, and so on, and not merely that they saw the God of Israel. For these words are solely intended to present a criticism of their act of seeing, not to describe the manner of their seeing. Thus, they were solely blamed for the form that their apprehension took, inasmuch as the corporeality entered into it to some extent, this being necessitated by their over hasty rushing forward before they had reached perfection.
What does it mean, the manner of seeing, rather than
or seeing, the act of seeing?
Yeah, what's the difference between the manner of seeing and the act of seeing?
Well, one is subjective and one is descriptive. The act of seeing is a fact. Either they saw and somebody saw them seeing, that's a fact, right? That can be documented by a witness. And then the manner of seeing, which is descriptive and subjective, because we don't know how they saw. We don't know what they saw. All we know is that they saw, but to quantify what it was or qualify what it was that they saw, we don't know.
So these words are intended to present a criticism of their act of seeing. So it was a criticism of the fact that they saw God in the first place, that they thought they were ready to see, that they were ready to act, to see, to perceive, not to describe how they were seeing in that moment, that they were literally seeing, or that they were seeing with not the highest eyes, that they allowed imagination to get into it, perhaps. What do you think?
I don't know. I think that's one of those distinctions that one can spend a lot of time thinking about, and in the process of thinking about it, refine one's mind. He has tons of these things here that are not tests for us, but things that we have to go through. So I am not sure what he's talking about with that.
Okay.
Well, could it be
Go ahead, Morris.
that before he was, Maimonides was talking about the fact that you can't really see God with your eyes. And, he made the point that, Moses was humble enough not to look. And you really have to apprehend God through your your soul or your intellect, however you want to, I guess, look at that. And that, and also he was warning against, trying to see God before you were ready, or trying to apprehend before you were ready.
Yeah.
Reminds me something of when something happens in an instant and you happen to see it, that in your mind, in a few minutes or a little while later, you wonder what it is you saw, and your mind keeps changing the details of what it is that you saw.
Mm-hmm. Well, there's, the chapter, I believe was before this, talks about the different manners of seeing. And I think it's an idea for us, well, at least I think, are less concrete beings in the times of Maimonides. We understand more intuitively. There's different modes of seeing. There's, the so-called seeing that we have in our minds, of seeing our own minds or seeing our own thoughts. Not that we see them, but we kind of perceive them. There is the seeing that we have of physically seeing something. There is the seeing, those who are engaged in meditation and prayer have a kind of spiritual seeing, and it's different than using the physical apparatus, but you have to use words that you have to describe something. And so he has a whole thing of talking about how the different words in the Torah correspond to different kinds of seeing or apprehending. So let's go forward a little bit, just and who is reading? Nancy, I think you were reading. Do you mind continuing on?
Sure. They deserve to perish is where I left off.
Oh,
yeah, right. They deserve to perish. I'm wondering about that. However, Moses, peace be upon him, interceded for them, and they were granted a reprieve until the time they were burnt at Taberah. Whereas Nadab, wait a minute, where am I? Where's Nadab? And Abihu were burnt in the tabernacle of the congregation, as it is stated in a correct tradition.
So the correct tradition is just a midrash, and the midrash makes, the midrash is always trying to understand if people died, why did they die? And, you can go back in the lives of that person, the Torah, to find where they sinned. So one of the ideas of why, there's endless ideas why Nadav and Avihu were killed by God in a very important moment in the book of Leviticus. But one idea is that the tent of meeting is like a nuclear reactor. If you're not wearing the proper clothes, you don't survive meeting nuclear material, right? Spiritual nuclear material. But then the other is just they made a mistake, and their mistake was either they went in drunk or they went at the wrong time and God got angry, or here it's they looked at God when they weren't ready, and so they paid the price later on.
What's the first incineration moment here? Taberach.
Yeah, you know what? I actually meant to look it up. It didn't strike. Didn't exactly at the very first moment. It must have been one of the times in the desert when something was happening. I can't remember which one.
Is that the Korach rebellion, or is that when the earth like swallows up the people who pick Korach versus Moses? Or is that
I'm looking it up right now. I meant to look it up earlier.
There's a lot of thinning of the herd in the desert.
Exactly. It's one of the many times
happens too many times.
burnt or died by plague, or something. It was one of those times where God was angry. And it might be one of those places where there's actually no story attached, but it's just said it's the place of burning. And then, well, why is it called the place of burning? And then the Midrash tells you
People were burned there.
Yeah.
So am I wrong? Does that mean that all 70 of the elders who saw God died? Or is that just, is Maimonides interpreting it very broadly to give this Taberach event more significance, and therefore retroactively make it so that they're all punished later? That seems like a pretty deep exegesis if it's not actually in the text itself.
No, I looked and I found it, and it is. I think it's at the very beginning. It's when the people have set out and they complain about, they need meat, and God brings the quail to them, and then they eat too much, and all of that story. And then it says at the end of it that place was called Tavera because they were let's see.
But these are the complaining people. These are not necessarily the 70, the elites that go up and have the drinking and wine feast with under God's feet.
I had it, and somehow I'm just on my phone looking it up, and somehow that's my impression. It's one of those. Now, when the people complain in the hearing of the Lord about their misfortunes, the Lord heard it, and his anger was kindled. Then the fire of the Lord burned against them and consumed some outlying parts of the camp. But the people cried out to Moses, and Moses prayed to the Lord, and the fire abated. So that place was called Tavera because the fire of the Lord burned against them. So it's actually even before the story of the meat, because then it's right afterwards. The rabble among them. Oh, this is where it is. The very beginning. It's literally the moment they set out. They for the first 10 chapters of Numbers, all the people are preparing to leave the camp. They blow the trumpets, and the very next verse is the people start complaining, and there's a rebellion among them, and then a fire breaks out, and then the fire is stopped. And right after this, right, so that place is called Tivra because the fire of the Lord burned against them. Right after that, there's a next story, and that's when the rabble among them say that they're craving meat. So it's at the beginning of their travels. They're not used to traveling in the desert, and there's this fire. And it doesn't say specifically the elders, but I guess there's a midrashic tradition which links
the two, yeah.
Which links the two.
Well,
Which
the rabble are
reminds me
complaining, the
that
only
there
ones,
used to be an 11th commandment, thou shalt not whine.
They shall not whine, yeah.
since the rabble were the ones left complaining, then the only ones who could have been smiced were the nobility, if you will, or the elite.
That must be the interpretive exegesis that gives us that, because it's I don't know, somewhat.
You're saying why did the elders get burned? Yeah, that's not pshat. So seems it's like the guillotine, right? You take the leaders first, and then all right. That's how it worked in the French Revolution. So this having happened to these men, it behooves us all the more. Let's continue. Nancy, do you mind continuing a little bit?
This having happened to these men, it behooves us all the more as being inferior to them. And it behooves those who are inferior to us to aim at and engage in perfecting our knowledge of preparatory matters and in the achieving of those premises that purify apprehension of its taint, which is error. It will then go forward to look upon the divine holy presence. It is accordingly said, and let the priests also that come near to the Lord sanctify themselves, lest the Lord break forth upon them. Accordingly, Solomon has bidden the man who wishes to reach this rank to be the most circumspect. He said, warningly in parabolic language, guard thy foot when thou goest to the house of God.
So going to the house of God, it seems, is not for the faint-hearted. There are lots of warnings about this. And whether one takes these warnings seriously or not so seriously depends on many things.
Mhm. And it's, you know, it's what's so interesting is that this is obviously in the Torah, right? We have the stories in the Dav and Avihu. We have other stories where don't approach God, don't approach the ark if you're not prepared, and God is a consuming fire. And when Maimonides is bringing, is he's interpreting it through a philosophical lens, which he's saying, what is the what is that preparatory work you need to do before you can apprehend God? Well, here it is. And why is it dangerous to enter God's presence? Here it is. So he's interpreting this Jewish idea through his his understanding, his philosophic lens, right? As mentioned before, slightly later Kabbalists, they'll interpret it similarly but differently. They'll say you have to be, you know, you have to be ready in a different way to apprehend God, but still this idea of God being serious and dangerous and walking to God's house not being for the faint-hearted, that's a very ancient idea, but it's interpreted different ways. Let's try and read a little bit more and then have a little bit more conversation.
I shall now go back in order to complete what we began to explain, and I shall say, because of the hindrances that were a stumbling block to the nobles of the children of Israel in their apprehension, their actions too were troubled. Because of the corruption of their apprehension, they inclined toward things of the body. Hence it says, and they envisioned God and did eat and drink. As for the rest of this passage, namely from the words of Scripture, and there was under his feet, as it were, a work of the whiteness of the sapphire stone, and so on, it will be explained in some of the chapters of this treatise.
I think that piece of it does not go with the rest of the piece of it, the eating and drinking. And I think the fact that he's mentioned this piece of it, under his feet, work of the whiteness of a sapphire stone, this may not be an incorrect apprehension, but eating and drinking was an incorrect action. At least that's the way I interpret this. So Maimonides is saying this particular vision that they had, they might have been onto something with this vision, but then with the eating and drinking, they weren't onto something. So I mean,
yeah, I don't think he was saying that the sapphire was incorrect, but maybe I'm wrong. But I thought that the idea of bringing in the corporeal, which are the feet, but also and then led them to the actions of the drinking and this. But maybe it's not. But
below the feet. Below the feet.
But the fact that it's even mentioning feet, you know, they must have, maybe they saw feet, so they were imagining that they were seeing feet.
Well, you know, later on when he gets into Ezekiel's vision, and you have to understand that this whole book is to explain Ezekiel's vision. He talks about the difference between Ezekiel's vision and Isaiah's vision. Isaiah's vision just is he saw God. Ezekiel's vision is he saw this huge thing that then he describes. So he may be playing here the tension between Isaiah, who had a much better understanding of the divine than Ezekiel. So Isaiah didn't see the sapphire stone per se. I mean, he didn't even comment on it in the chapter that Maimonides talks. I think it's chapter 5 of book 3, where he talks about Isaiah and his difference from Ezekiel. So the introduction of this, all of these things, all of these mentions of things that then have a place in Ezekiel's vision are there for a purpose in the introduction, in the early
Well,
part.
Yeah, I mean,
Maimonides is also telling us, don't be hasty. I'm not finished with this discussion yet. There's
Right.
still more to come.
Mhm.
So, you haven't reached the true belief yet. We're still getting there.
Everything is connected, and on some level, though, I'm not always, I don't always agree with some of the modern scholars. Merkava mysticism, right? There's a whole idea that so much of Jewish mysticism is either Maaseh Bereshit or Maaseh Merkava, right? The work of creation or the work of the chariot. And Maimonides does say this, and that so obviously Ezekiel's vision is because of the sapphire is being referenced here, and Ezekiel's vision is considered to be, and you read it, the first few chapters of Ezekiel, you see why. And I personally at least don't go. I won't judge which one Maimonides might, but I'm not sure I agree with that. Ezekiel or Isaiah's vision is more is higher, or however you can look at it. But they're both different. But it is true that all that right, it says with Isaiah, it says that Isaiah beheld God, and it doesn't talk about it talks a little bit about his shape. It says you could see the robes and coming down, and there's the idea of so part of this, maybe this is an interesting place to bring this in, but one of the reactions to the philosophers or to Maimonides, where or the corporal, he doesn't want to go there. He says this is all either it's an image or it's a symbolism, and don't look at it. The Kabbalists, they don't want to. They're both trying to look at apprehending God, but the Kabbalists said we can't completely discount it. It doesn't mean we think that there's a real throne, that there's a real, as real as our world or similarly to our world, but we do think that the divine manifests using shapes, or using shapes that work with our own minds, or that come into our own minds to tell us something. So the Kabbalists won't always go to the place where the less corporeal, the higher the vision. They'll sometimes say that a vision that's very descriptive and vivid, that's how that's a very powerful vision. It's not only how corporal or not corporal the vision is. It's not a lack of vision. It's out of and it's just out of what God is giving you, right? And the philosophers will not say God is giving you this vision. It's just you're perceiving the waves, the overflow with whatever capacity you have. But the Kabbalists will say, well, God is giving you a specific vision to teach you something about what he's showing you. So he gave Ezekiel a certain vision to teach Ezekiel something about God, which Ezekiel had to apprehend. He gave Isaiah something, and he gave Moses something. And there are obviously different abilities among different prophets, but it's a less, God is doing something, while the philosophers, at least my sense, would not always say that God is doing something. It's just happening almost naturally. And so when I read this chapter and I think about preparation, and I think about not being over hasty, and I think of Maimonides and the path that he created, which was so powerful in his time, right? A path of intellect. He didn't create it, but he brought it into Judaism on some level, right? A path of intellectual apprehension, the path of, as we were saying earlier, just fine-tuning the mind to such an extent that you're able to reach divine truths. And maybe that was the path for his time, and a very powerful path. I just think our circumstances are so different in our day. And this is this was a zeitgeist of Maimonides. This is what was happening in his time. There were philosophic ideas, and there were other ideas. There were also Islamic Sufi ideas, right? Maimonides' son becomes a Sufi. And in our days, there are almost different influences, right? The 60s and 70s brought the influence of Eastern traditions into Judaism, and of other kinds of ideas into Judaism, which or of the older Hasidic ideas were brought in by some of the neo-Hasidic leaders, or even Buber and others into mainstream Judaism. And that was their way of bringing in, so what's the path of our time, and what's the preparation that people in our days need to do before they can apprehend these types of truths? I think connected to what the truth that the Maimonides is talking about, at least in my view, is still the case. You can't rush into spiritual life. You can't rush into spiritual apprehension, but maybe for us it's a little bit different. Our lives are so full of stimuli. It's focus and concentration of a different kind to blot out all of that noise that's in the outside, which is what's needed for us in our times. Maybe for us to achieve that our minds are broader in some ways and more interconnected than the minds of people in medieval times who are very local and where our minds are on Zoom traveling across the world, so to speak. So we have different challenges and different opportunities in how we do this. And part of that, go ahead.
But with all of that said, isn't the basic essence that Judaism meets you where you are? And Maimonides is trying to get you to move up the ladder, so to speak, in terms of your perception. But I think there's at least a sense here that Maimonides is saying, if you're at a certain point, it doesn't mean you're cut off. You can still be Jewish. You can still have a certain reality and a spirituality that allows you to practice your Judaism in a way that is comfortable and that challenges you at the same time.
I definitely think that's true. Judaism meets you where you are and where you want to go. Also, it's in both of those. It meets you and it can give you something. But just like he's trying to encourage people slowly and in whatever way they are able to take on this path. I think in our century we have the same challenge and the same opportunity to, from wherever we are, to try and meet the tradition in new ways, not the places where we already are comfortable, but also to try and grow as best we can into new ways, and to keep on looking, but in a cautious way, and not to be too hasty, as you were saying. So I'm going to end very quickly, and then we have to go. I brought one text from Reb Zalman Schachter Shalomi, who is a spiritual leader of Judaism. He founded the Renewal Movement, but in the sense that he was also concerned about apprehension of God as a goal of religion. I looked up from other thinkers. I would have maybe liked to find a quote from there, but I didn't find that as easily. And here he's in some ways saying something very different than Maimonides. I'm not endorsing either one. I think both of those work, Maimonides' past and Reb Zalman's. But faith is what I call a mind move, a radical shift in awareness. The expression, the leap of faith, is so true. Faith is not something we can arrive at by a careful step-by-step process. It is not something we can square with our intellect. Faith does not make sense, nor does it feel safe. It is what takes us further after the questions that can be answered logically have been exhausted. To have faith, we must let go. Faith is like swimming the backstroke, reaching above and behind us into an unknown we cannot see. Faith is like driving forward with only the rear view mirror as a guide. So maybe at the very last stage, him and Maimonides would agree. And I think he's not just saying faith the way we talk about faith, but he's talking about spiritual life. So I leave you with that thought of what is it that we each can do to prepare in our own lives to take small or big step forward in how to prepare to apprehend more, to perceive more of the beauty and truths of the universe. Nice to see everybody. Shabbat Shalom, early Shabbat Shalom, and see you soon.
All right. Thank you very much, Rabbi.
Thank you very much.
Lot to think about here.
Yes, thank
Thanks,
you.
everyone.
Bye. Thanks, everybody.